divide. So I'd like to introduce the concept and talk a little bit about potential implications of the divide in the emerging technological landscape.
Excuse me, can you get those people to
The
stop?
fundamental question is, what is automation? Automation is the application
Yeah, because we're having
to tasks once
in there.
performed by human beings or to tasks that would otherwise be impossible. And another important point about automation is that it generally implies the integration of machines into a self-governing system. This is 1895 cartoon, which I thought was funny. But automation, of course, is far from new, and we can go back in time. This is the robotic arm, the assembly line, the textile machine, steam engine, and the digital computer. We can even go back to the antiquity. This is the Antikythera, the world's oldest analog computer. So, and yeah, okay, I'll talk loud, I guess, in the interest of time. So, historically, we've had a number of industrial revolutions. At each time, we have an introduction of disruptive technologies, many of which have led to automation of different types. So there's the Industrial Revolution of 1780s, 1860s. Of course, 1870s to 1960s, we have mass production, electric power, labor division, and assembly line. More recently, we have the Information Industrial Revolution with computers and first-generation robotics. And now, many believe we are entering into a fourth industrial revolution, which is defined by a cluster of disruptive technologies, for example, advanced robotics, drones, 3D printing, Internet of Things, nanotechnology, blockchain, big data, quantum computing, and AI, including machine learning and deep learning. And all of these technologies are being integrated with each other and with the internet to create what are called cyber-physical systems, and this is leading to new forms of automation, which has a lot of people worried. And I opened up my news feed this morning, and this was the headline, DeepMind's AlphaZero now showing human-like intuition in historical turning point for AI. The big concern here is that with these new technologies, AI included, is that they will be able to automate pretty much everything that a human being can do, including thinking and reasoning and things like that. So I have this idea of the automation divide, which is closely related to the digital divides, and it's the idea that automation disproportionately negatively affects or even harms certain people, organizations, and places, or that it benefits some people, organizations, and places more than others. Key questions here moving forward, and speaking mainly about the fourth industrial revolution, will automation in the fourth industrial revolution simply extend traditional forms of inequality, or will it also engender new forms of social, economic, and digital exclusion? Will it manifest countertrends that alleviate traditional inequalities while constituting new modalities of inequality? In these regards, what might unfold in the near term, medium term, and even further out? I'm thinking, 100 years into the future. And of course, how can we intervene to mitigate gaps and disparities tied to automation? And most importantly, to ensure that all people, organizations, and places are equal participants and beneficiaries in this emerging smart and automated landscape. So we can take a quick survey of what's happened historically and some things that are happening right now in terms of this automation divide. We know that anytime a new technology, particularly disruptive technology or extreme technological innovation is introduced, it improves the welfare of people. And here we have a trend. We have a graph showing the improvements in life expectancy. And you can see right about here is where we had the first industrial revolution. And we can expect to see something similar with the technologies that are emerging right now. So you can think about technologies that are used to augment human intelligence and other related capabilities. But we know that technology is a double-edged sword, okay? So with the good always comes some bad. One concern has to do with job displacement, and there's been a lot of work done looking at the third industrial revolution, information technology, and first-generation robotics. And what these scholars have found is that over the last few decades, medium skill, medium wage jobs have been displaced, while other jobs have increased, and that's led to a hollowing out of the middle class. But we know one thing, and there was recently a big study done on this, that if you look historically at every industrial revolution that's happened, we've never, ever had a time where over the long term we've seen a net loss in jobs. What we see is job loss in the short run, but over the longer term we see increases in productivity, income, demand for goods and services, and employment, and also we see always the rise of new occupations. And we've done a little work looking at this from 2010 to 2015, extending the work of others who have looked at the information revolution. This is something similar to what they're doing. The middle part would be your middle class jobs. And what we're looking for in this diagram here is whether or not in that middle part we see a continuation of decrease. And what you can see, this is broken down by gender, it's broken down by census region, and it's broken down by job type. You can see that not all the bars go down, some are going up. So we may be seeing a reversal. Oops, not that. Okay, and already AI has actually created more jobs than it's displaced. Recent study in UK showed that 800,000 low-skilled jobs have been eliminated as a result of AI, but 3.5 million new jobs were created, and many of those jobs have higher wages than jobs that existed before. Of course, we need people to design, manage, and operate the robots. But where are the people that have the skills to do this? And here's an interesting map looking at the skills divide in terms of global AI talent, and you can clearly see a north-south divide in this map, with the northern countries having people with the skills and southern countries not having. Okay, and humans are still very much needed in the loop, and what we may see, this is pertaining to Internet of Things in particular, is that automation indeed will reduce the need for operational and formal skills, but it will increase the need for other kinds of skills, including those related to information, strategy, and communications. Blockchain is an interesting development. This is a very new technology that's taking off. And there are a lot of people claiming that blockchain is going to be the ultimate democratizing technology. It's a distributed ledger. In theory, anybody can participate, can add data to this, can store data and access it. It involves a lot of automation, mainly automation of transactions, including validation of those transactions. And already there are a number of blockchain apps going on in the world. I actually have one that I'm developing for India right now, which is not on this map yet. But you can see these are applications related to public sector and government. Blockchain, indeed, is already having positive impacts and making society more inclusive. So some of the blockchain apps are focused on homeless and providing homeless people with digital IDs in order to in order to help them to better engage civically and otherwise. But as I mentioned earlier, technology is always a double-edged sword. And if you look at Bitcoin is actually the first application of blockchain. A number of studies have been done on what's happened with this development. This is a very interesting one because what they find in this study is that there's a Matthew effect going on in the Bitcoin networks and preferential attachment. And this is giving rise to major power imbalances in the Bitcoin network. So here we have hash rates. Hash rates are the people or organization who are doing the validation of the transactions. And you can see that basically we have a couple of very big players and a lot of very small players. Okay, another example here, this is a map of blockchain nodes, Bitcoin and Ethereum, by country, and you can see based on the height of the heights on the map that most of the Bitcoin mining right now is being done in the northern part of the world, less so in the southern part of the world. Another example of our north-south divide. We have some complicating factors, perfect. We know that digital divide is a vicious cycle. And I have questions about whether or not we can actually ever solve this problem, because what we see is every time a new technological innovation is introduced, there's growing inequality. Over time, others catch on, they get access to that technology, inequality drops, and then the cycle reverses, it repeats itself as soon as another technology is introduced. And this is, by the way, looking at broadband infrastructure. There's also this thing called the technology treadmill, which means that over time, the rate of technological innovations has been increasing. In fact, doubling times are growing. So technology is growing exponentially, and since 1400 has doubled every 200 years, analogous to Moore's law. This makes it even more difficult to deal with this digital divide, especially when we get into issues related to education and training. So what can we do? Let me just quickly overview some of the things that people are talking about. One is the idea of universal basic income, and that's the idea that we basically give everybody a minimum amount of income, regardless of whether or not they're working, sort of a welfare system. You might think it's crazy, but actually there are a number of pilot programs going on all over the world implementing UBI, and would be interesting to study. Here's another crazy idea, perhaps, and this is actually coming from Bill Gates, who suggests that we should actually tax robots. They're going to take the jobs away from us, make them pay for it. Education and training, very, very important, and we'll need to have programs in place for reskilling, deskilling, and upskilling. In fact, there was a recent PBS NewsHour that was devoted to automation, and it was centered around the idea that education is the key to addressing the negative implications of automation, including things related to the automation divide. And lastly, let's not forget about the other digital divides. So you need to have some basic infrastructure to be able to access and use and benefit from these emerging technologies. For example, at a bare minimum, you need to have a good broadband connection. So another strategy here is to try and address the other digital divides as a way of enabling people, places, and organizations to access and benefit from emerging tech. So this is just an overview of the idea and some of the potential implications. This definitely merits further examination, and Connie and I are working on this together. We hope to be able to study this in greater depth in the coming years. Okay.
Just to give you a little background, I did not start out as a programmer. I've spent 30 years in information technology. I'm a liberal arts person. And what I discovered with my career is this. If you're a programmer, you're always one step behind the machine. That's a given. So in my career, I started out as a grunt assembly language programmer on a mainframe. Most of you will not know anything about that. And now, all of a sudden, I'm magically called a data scientist, and people bow down before me. I'm the same guy, I do the same stuff, but all of a sudden, what you discover with IT is that certain skills, where you repurpose them, they all of a sudden gain in prestige over time. Nowadays, I focus more on ontologies and semiotics, especially in the world of IoT, where one of my friends and I are working on a project to do that. We have talked a lot about the technologies, and because I've come out of a technology world, I started to focus more and more on governance and how do I operationalize policies to cross or to bridge the digital and knowledge divide, and especially the north-south divide. And there are complex issues that I focus on these days, and I focus on two different levels of research, macro context and micro context. Okay, the proposition, the knowledge divide is essentially a digital divide. I came to this point where I was at a talk with Brian Wafafora. You can see the type rooms having all sorts of trouble because we run out of W's and we run out of A's as you type this name. But he was the director of Pearson Education in South Africa. And he pointed out a very interesting fact when I talked to him 5 years ago, or 4 years ago. We produce more books in Denmark than in all of Africa. And he saw this as a problem because he focused not so much only on technology diffusion, but also simply on knowledge diffusion and also the older kinds of knowledge diffusion. And it ties back into the talk of Cassidy, which is where we focus not only on authorship, but also on patents and how does knowledge get get shared among people. Okay, as a corollary, then I add, in my discussion with him, I added a corollary, which is how can we use IC2 to improve the likelihood of human well-being and flourishing in the global economy? Because most of the stuff we focus on is GDP-based. We really don't focus much on what happens to individuals. So, we don't need to worry about this, the digital and human flourishing, and but this is a nice quote, which I like, from Melvin Kranzberg in 1986, and it ties into what Laurie was talking about. Technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. As a reminder that we must constantly compare short-term with long-term results. The utopian hopes versus the spotted reality, what might have been against what actually happened, the trade-off among various goods and possible bads. And this is something I always keep in mind, and I have it glued to my computer when I do any of this type of research. That when I do consult to people, people expect me to say, you know, that technology is the panacea to solve all your problems. Well, they're not. They can't be. It's no more than a plowshare can help me fix my car. You know, you have to figure out, well, you could, I suppose, but it's not very effective. Okay. So really what I focus on are two things that are throughout all our talks, and that is the notion of networks and flows. And invariably, whether you talk about trade or you talk about migration, technology diffusion, you're always talking about communities, either communities of people, communities of nations, and usually as geospatially, because that's our focus today between the northern and southern hemisphere. So the things I'm always interested in is GDP, trade, technology diffusion, and that has changed because now we are more in a world of global IT and IoT, where that changes. Education, the ability of to become educated, humanitarian services, and what I also look at now, and especially in the world now when most of the governments are becoming neo-fascist and neo-right-wing, the opportunities for FDI and remittances. Can I immigrate and send money home? So what I looked at from an individual level, at the micro level, what are the opportunities that a person can have to instantiate a potential for flourishing? And I look at goods and services, i.e. what can you do and to what you have access. How do I go? What do I want to do? How do I change those into abilities I can do? And then how do I choose to change my life? Okay, so I started to work with a institutional framework, and my apologies, I'm not very good with PowerPoint. So I look at governance, the normative things, national jurisprudential executive institutions, society and culture. The thing that I focus on especially are such things as marriage. One of the critical things that I was working with was the ratio of child brides. We had a recent case in Sudan where somebody sold a girl for a car and a cattle just simply to be a spouse. I focus on that. I focus also on individual access to participation in the economy. Can you work? And I found this based on my own research and also my own experience. That, for example, in Karnataka, if women have an opportunity to work, there's less likelihood that they will marry early, and therefore will have a greater likelihood of have a life with a greater level of well-being. And as a simple fact, we may not like the rate of pay that these folks have, but compare what they have before, they can now move out of an androcratic situation that they have in their households. I found this a very interesting phenomenon. That does not mean that this does not happen in the United States either. There are very few laws on the book in the United States against child marriage, which I found surprising. The other thing is intellectual freedom. Can I create an intellectual persona? Do I have the freedom and the capabilities to reaffirm my identity, to develop ideas, to publish those ideas, and get credit for them? This is also one of the things that we need to focus on when we look at IT and when we look at bridging the divides. Also education and the creation of collaboration. The other thing that I look at are national capacities. For example, transportation, electricity, but also ICT, broadband, so on and so forth, but also other things. Do I have potable water? Do I have access to healthcare? One of the things I discovered when I was doing some work with the UN, that there are fights over water rights that I did not expect. But you can see that if you know the history of the West, and some of us do come out of the West, where water is critical, and potable water is critical. Also, such things that I noticed is women had a lot of bronchial things because they're cooking. They cooked over charcoal fire. I did not know that. I mean, I'm male, what the hell? It's not something that comes up in my world every day. Also participation, and this is national participation in world economies, will help in the bridging. And participation in global value change, foreign direct investment, technology diffusion, and I don't mean just simply shipping technology over there. But what is happening also with the globalizing world is that I can control a factory here while living in, let's say, in India, that I can control here. So there are subtle ways of diffusion that we have to talk about. The other thing that I noticed, and there's a north and south that we have not, a north and south divide, is the international debt burden. IMF still focuses on debt rather than capacity or the ability to pay debt. Things that have changed now too is migration. That we have a crisis in Europe, and we have a crisis at the border here, where all of a sudden people are not allowed to move. And even though the demographics may suggest that one ought to let in immigrants simply where we have aging populations, there's a strong political movement in the northern hemisphere to limit migration. Okay, let me go to the other points. The enablers not here. The caveats. And we talked about this a little bit. Deprivation, displacement, and exclusion. Digital and knowledge device will expand. But what that means is that people are going to be displaced. Increased ICT surveillance can compromise democratic institutions, and so on and so forth. We also have corruption. And one of the things that you also worry about is commodification of human rights. In some countries, healthcare is considered a human right. Here, it's a commodity. Education here is considered to be a commodity these days and no longer a human right. The other thing, attitudes and behavior. I can go into Michigan and to a small town, and we see this inversion between the political diversion in this country. We like our way of life. We like to live close by to our family, this, that, and other thing. We don't like to move. Other thing are attitudes and behavior. Girls are not good at chemistry. Computers are for rich kids. I run into that quite a bit. And also belief systems, both political and cult, that type of thing. Limitations of technologies, and the question here of coexistence of old and new technologies. Not all new, what do we do with the old technologies that are still effective? Why do we get rid of them? Why should we? And I went through that myself. I started out as a programmer on a mainframe, then I went to LAN, WAN, and so on and so forth. And now I am retired. And this is for us as analysts where we have to focus on. When we talk about North and South divide and we're trying to operationalize things, we use different units of analysis and different units of measurement. We focus too much, I think, on economics. We don't, okay. And the one that I finally, and I'll leave with that, is ideological anachronism. Normally when we talk about the North-South divide, we talk about a brand line. This 1980s Cold War type of technology. And we're still bound by those frames. Sorry, I run out of time. Yeah. I'm more than happy to discuss this with anyone afterwards.